Hey everyone, it's Mystery Girl and I'm Missy. I know I've been promising you all we're going to New Hampshire, and guess what? That's where we're going. But before we go, I do want to let you know that this will be one of my last videos for maybe a month or two. I will be undergoing a major surgery and will not be able to make the videos the way I would normally like to. So I really hope you all enjoy this video. A little over 2 years ago, my husband and I finally moved out of New York. Our first night in our new place, after an adventurous ride, as you can see here, we ended up with no power, and we actually met one of our neighbors who was from New Hampshire. That night, she knocked on our door and she offered us a flashlight to make sure that we had what we needed. And from that day, our neighbor has been my very best friend. I thought it would be great if Cathy was able to share some of her experiences in New Hampshire, both growing up from birth to 16 and then growing up from 16 to the time that she left New Hampshire. So who better to tell that and share that than Cathy herself. Hi, Cathy.
Hi.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about growing up in New Hampshire?
Oh, not at all. My heart will always belong to New Hampshire.
I thought we could start with Laconia. Can you tell us a little of Laconia?
Laconia is a city with 15,000 people approximately, and it's in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, which is pretty much at the center of the state.
So on the map, I see that you know, from knowing you, I also know you lived in Guilford, so I know that they're not too far away. Which do you prefer, Laconia or Guilford?
Well, as a child, I loved living in Laconia because we were only about 5 blocks from the downtown area and able to walk there and do things, and there's lakes all over the place and mountains are there. But Guilford has the charm of being a rural place, and it's a town, and it has its own histories. And it was once part of Laconia.
So Cathy, I know you had lived in 2 different houses in Iconia. Can you tell us about growing up and some of your friends in Iconia?
When I was a child in kindergarten or first grade and in the elementary level, we lived on a street with several other children, and we always looked out for each other. We would go down to the park and watch the Little League games, watch them play tennis. We would swim in Lake Opeechee. They had 2 swimming areas, and we all learned to swim there. And it was just an amazing neighborhood. Everybody was there was always something for the kids to do.
That had to be great, moving from one house to another, but on the same block, so you didn't lose any friends.
No, I didn't. Nope. And for the first 4 years of my life, I was the only girl on the street. They were all boys.
The only girl?
Yes. And then one day, I was walking up the street on the sidewalk to go to my aunt's house, and I saw a school bus stop right across the street from my aunt's house. And this little girl got out. And that little girl, whose name is Jane, and I were inseparable. And to this day, we have never stopped being best friends since, and it's now, we're in our 60. It was 67 years ago that we met.
Wow, I know. I have heard so many great stories of you and Jane, and I love every single one. I have laughed through so many of them. It sounds like you guys had such amazing times.
We did, and then Cindy, the following year, she moved in and next door to Jane, so it was the 3 of us. And, you know, in my generation, on Sunday nights, you watched the Lawrence Welk show. So we called ourselves the sisters that were were on there, and we took their names, and we learned their songs, and we did all
Oh
that.
my God, it sounds like so much fun.
It was. But we also, the mothers always looked out for, the kids, and my mother would be the watch person at the beach to make sure that everybody stayed,
Out of trouble?
Yeah, that was it.
There was always somebody's mother looking to make sure somebody wasn't in trouble.
Yes.
So, Cathy, you mentioned about going swimming down at Lake Okefenokee. What are you laughing at?
Well, that might be a cousin of Lake Okeechee, which is...
Oh my God, no! If it was me, we'd be doing the hokey pokey down at the lake. Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about Lake Okefenokee?
Okeechee.
Okeechee. Okay, I got it right this time.
It's a small lake, not as big as the others, but it is in a beautiful setting. And it is just an amazing place. So there's the park that goes with it. And there's Little League, there's tennis, there's track the track that goes around, and swings and stuff for the little kids. And it's been there for as long as I can remember. Oh, and even as a child, we would sit in the kitchen to have breakfast, and there was a racetrack going around for horses. And there was a guy that had a horse, and every morning he would run on that track.
Wow. Now, I know you have told me about the fireworks shows. Can you tell us a little bit?
Yes. In the evening, every July 3rd, night before 4th of July, all of the people, it was a public park, so everyone could go and watch the fireworks, but everybody brought picnic dinners and set that up, and my grandfather played in the band, sitting on the bleachers, and it was a wonderful, and the fireworks were just amazing.
It sounds so family oriented.
It is, and it was also in a time when everybody lived more family oriented.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us, Cathy.
You're welcome. Anytime. It's just good memories. I'll always have them.
So before we move on to Guilford, I do want to apologize for mutilating the name of the lake. But next time any of Cathy's friends go to the lake, do the hokey pokey for me. So Cathy, can you now tell us a little bit about Guilford? I know you moved to Guilford, I think you said when you were 16, right?
Yes, 16, going into my junior year of high school.
Wow. Can you tell us a little bit about Guilford?
Yes, Guilford is a very old town. It's rural. Lots of hills and mountains and beautiful lakes, and the scenery is just absolutely mind-blowing. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, and I know you've told me many times about the mountains and skiing.
Yes, and we have a famous person living in Guilford. She was born and raised in Guilford. She was on the Olympic ski team, and she won a silver medal.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if it was for slalom or downhill, but she came back to Guilford afterwards, and she met this man in Austria, and they got married, and they ran the ski school at our mountain resort, Gunstock.
Oh my goodness. Now, is that the ski school that you told me had the best donuts? I remember you mentioning a mountain that had really great donuts. They were fresh.
That's the one. Oh, yes.
That's the
yes,
one?
in the lodge. Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you could eat in the lodge. Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it was very old. It'd been there forever. And my dad, when he was young, he skied there. And but it's a beautiful. I lived at Gunstock from the time the first snowflakes hit the ground until they finally melted away. So.
I know. I know when school was closed because of snow, you'd wait for Mom to leave, and next thing you know, Cathy would be in her little VW bug and heading to the mountains, right?
Yes. Unfortunately, the chairlift was closed because of the blizzard. But somehow we got to use the T-bar and the other ways to get up to the top of the mountain.
Okay, so Missy here, I have never been skiing. So how hard is it to get up that mountain when the lift isn't working?
You don't do it. You just go to the lower ones, the ones that don't go up as high.
You see, now me, I would crawl up and slide down on my snowsuit.
Well, we all start out that way.
If I ever tried to come down on a ski, I'd come down with 2 broken legs.
Either that, or if you feel a little nervous, you just sit down and let the skis take you.
What are some of your other favorite things about Guilford?
We had our own beach on the Lake Winnipesaukee. It was a town beach. Beautiful shade trees and barbecue pits, and on Sundays I used to love to go there because the sailboats would come out for people. Anybody who had a sailboat, and they would just go all over the place just to watch the sails and the it was just beautiful.
Oh, wow. Now, I know I'm making a video about New Hampshire, and you don't know exactly where I'm going with this video, but I really, really appreciate the background that you've experienced in New Hampshire. It kind of lets everybody that's never been there have an idea of how tranquil and beautiful it is. It really sounds gorgeous.
It is. In fact, the large Lake Winnipesaukee, has over 300 islands in it, and it takes at least 3 hours to go around the lake.
3 hours just to go around the lake. Wow. Now, I did a little research myself, and I'm not going to tell you the areas I'm doing because I don't want you to know. But from Laconia, on one of the areas that I'm doing, you were 57 miles away from. And on the other area that I'm doing, you were 78 miles away from it, from Laconia. Now, when you lived in Guilford, from one of the areas, you were only 54 miles away, which was about an hour and 6 minutes by car. And the second area was 64 miles, so it was an hour and 26 minutes away by car. So you really weren't that far away from what I'm going to be covering here. And I'm sure you might have heard about what I'm going to be going into, but you have no clue what this video's about, right?
I have no clue, but I'm anxious to find out.
And I hope I do you and New Hampshire and the stories, because there's more than one story. I really hope I do them justice.
Oh, you will.
Before I move on to what I'm going to get into, I want to give you the opportunity to say hi to some of your friends. Would you like to do that?
Yes. The friends that I grew up with was my cousin Tom. There was Jane, there was Cindy's brother Michael, there was Janice, there was Rosemary, there was Darnell. This is just on our street.
That's only one street?
That was just we all lived across the street or down the street or next door to each other. And there were and then there was Alan. I think that was about it.
Wow. And I know you still keep in contact with a lot of them.
Yes, in fact, we had a neighborhood reunion in 2012 at Lake Opeechee on the beach.
Do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around.
Yeah, and all the women grew up to look just like their mothers. And all the boys grew up to look just like their dads.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yes.
All right, so guys, I want Cathy to say goodbye to everybody right now. And when I go back to my home, I am going to continue the story as a surprise for Cathy and her friends of their hometown. So thank you so much for filling us in, Cathy.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So Cathy, before I go home and I continue making your surprise video, which you better not know anything about this, which you know everything about New Hampshire, so you probably have an inkling of when I start talking about it, I think you'll have an idea of what it's about. But before I do that, do you want to give a shout out and a hello to anybody?
Yes, I will give a shout out to all of the kids that I grew up with. And that starts with Dave and Kim and her brother Jay, who has in memory of. And then there was Cindy and her brother Mike, who I saw take his very first steps.
Aww.
Because he was just a baby when I met them. And then there's Jane.
Of course there's Jane.
Yes. And there's Janice and Rosemary and Jim and Jean and Mike, who in memory of. And then we had Darnell and her sister Cindy and her brother Wayne.
And I know you wanted to mention your cousin.
And my cousin Tom and his sister Pat and older brother Mike. They were a lot older than we were at the time, so we didn't really kick the ball with them.
Yeah, but it was all great memories.
Oh, sure. And that's about it.
Anybody she forgot, don't think she don't love you, because she talks about everybody from New Hampshire all the time. She loves and misses you guys so much. All right, everyone, let's get into it. We're going back to New Hampshire in the 1600s. We're going to visit Portsmouth and we're going to visit Hampton. And we're going to talk about two women, one by the name of Jane and one by the name of Eunice. Now, Cathy has gone into some of her history, and when I was looking at the map, I really realized just how close she was to both of these women that we're going to be discussing. Now, Jane and Eunice lived about 12.9 miles away from each other, and Cathy, when she lived in Laconia, she was only 57.8 miles from Portsmouth, so that's an hour and 12-minute ride by car. And she was about 78.9 miles from Hampton, which is where Eunice was, and that's an hour and 24 minutes by car. When Cathy was 16, she moved to Guilford. So she was only 54 miles from Portsmouth, which is where Jane was. And that's an hour and 6 minutes by car. And from Hampton, which is where Eunice was, she was 64.9 miles, and that's about 1 hour and 26 minutes by car. So as you can see, Cathy and her friends didn't live far. New Hampshire was one of the 13 original colonies of the United States, and Portsmouth was founded in 1623. That is where Jane is from. Did you know that New Hampshire was first named North Virginia, and it was once under the jurisdiction of Massachusetts? Captain John Smith of England first began a colonization project which provided ships and provisions, free land bestowed, with one important condition, that it remain always subject to English sovereignty. Smith first named it North Virginia, but King James later revised this into New England. To the map was added the name Portsmouth, taken from the English town where Captain John Mason was commander of the fort, and the name New Hampshire is that of his own English county of Hampshire. Captain Mason died in 1635, just before his proposed trip to the new country, which he never saw. He had invested more than £22,000 in cleared land, building houses, preparing for its defense. But then, Dover and Portsmouth had expanded into Hampton and Exeter. So John Mason named the new settlement New Hampshire after his homeland in Hampshire County, England. It was a royal province prior to 1641, when it was claimed by Massachusetts Bay Colony and was dubbed the Upper Province of Massachusetts in 1680. New Hampshire returned to its status as a royal province, but this lasted only until 1688, when it again became part of Massachusetts. New Hampshire regained its independence in 1741. The colony became a state. In 1774, New Hampshire became the first colony to declare independence from England. The colony became a state, an independent state, in 1788. In January 1776, New Hampshire formed its own government when the United States became the United States of America. New Hampshire is a state in New England region of the United States. It is bordered by Massachusetts to the south, Vermont to the west, Maine and the Gulf of Maine to the east, and the Canadian province of Quebec to the north. The town of Dover, Portsmouth, Exeter, and Hampton were the main settlements. Of the 50 U.S. states, New Hampshire is the fifth smallest by area, 9.349 miles, and the 10th least population, with slightly less than 1.3 million residents. Now, to give you an idea, I'm from Suffolk County, Long Island, New York, and the population just in Suffolk County is 1.5 million. In all of New York, the population is 8.38 million. Think about that. One county in New York has more people than all of New Hampshire. This is based on the 2020 census. New Hampshire has a motto, it's live free or die, which reflects its role in the American Revolutionary War, which started on April 19, 1775, with the exchange of gunfire at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and ended officially September 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. Okay, I know you're probably asking, what's with the history lesson, Missy? I'm so sorry, but it is so important to this story that we're going to get into. And well, you know I love mysteries. Have you ever heard of Eunice Cole or Goody Cole? Comment below, yes or no. What if I say, have you ever heard of Jane Walford? Comment below, yes or no. What if I told you that these two women were suspected to be part of the Salem Witch trials? Do you think that they were part of the Salem Witch trials? Now you have an idea of where I'm going, don't you? So before we get into the Salem Witch trials, I had to go into the history of New Hampshire being part of Massachusetts, because through these two women's lives, they repeatedly go back and forth to Massachusetts. So, decades before the Salem Witch trials, there was two women who stood trial for witchcraft in New Hampshire in the same exact year, both living within just a few miles of each other. Both women's lives ended quite differently. So who's Jane Walford? Jane Walford was one of the first women to own land in the New World. Combined with her documented healing powers, this made her the object of both envy and even fear. To some of her neighbors, this made her a witch. Jane, who was an accused witch, Walford, also known as Jane Guy, was born sometime in 1598 in South Yorkshire, England. She was married to Thomas Walford II in 1623. They had 7 children. They immigrated in the year 1623 during the Puritan Great Immigration, and she was the first woman to be accused of witchcraft. Jane died September 7, 1681 in Portsmouth, Rockingham County, New Hampshire. New Hampshire's seacoast communities might have been primed for a potential witch hunt. It's almost like you could have a mini outbreak of witchcraft on the seacoast. There were several factors that likely contributed to the outbreaks of witchcraft accusations in New England, primarily the Puritan population of the seacoast. The Puritans were responsible for more witchcraft trials and executions than any other group of early American colonizers. Potentially because in the 17th century they grew more interested in rooting out common forms of household magic. At the time, a lot of people routinely performed small acts of magic, like spells for toothaches or finding lost objects, which most of us would consider medication or just looking around your house. I don't know, but back then it was considered witchcraft. Some people found themselves on the wrong side of the line, a confusing and terrifying term that was codified into religious and legal doctrine in England and eventually in New Hampshire. So what is the story of Jane Walford? It was a Sunday evening, March 30th, 1656. This was the night that good wife Jane Walford turned into a cat. This was according to the testimony of Susanna Trimmings of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, whom was walking home that night when she was confronted by Jane Walford. Quote, "Lend me a pound of cotton," end quote, she demanded. To which Susanna refused. First verbally threatened by Walford, she was then, quote, "struck as with a clap of fire," end quote, before the witch vanished by the waterside in the shape of a cat, end quote. This was Miss Trimmings' testimony under oath at court on April 18, 1656. Her husband Oliver also testified, saying that his wife returned home in a sad condition and she could not speak, as if something in her throat prevented her from doing so. When she was finally able to speak, she said, quote, "Lord have mercy upon me. This wicked woman will kill me," end quote. In court weeks later, Miss Trimmings still complained of being ill. Jane had supporters. One testified that he'd seen Jane at home the evening of the question. Jane Walford was brought into the courtroom in June 1656 along with her son Jeremiah, likely the witness who said he and his wife were at the Goodman Walford's home the entire night. Several others entered the court, including John and Agnes Puddington, who relayed the story of a yellow cat that would follow the wife of W. Evans all day. One day, Miss Evans visited the Puddington home and the yellow cat arrived that evening. John attempted to shoot it, but his gun failed to work. 2 other cats joined the party, and then, quote, the yellow one vanished away on the plain ground, end quote. The other 2 also taking off at the same time. Another testimony came from Nicholas Rowe, who claimed Jane Walford visited his bedroom on 2 occasions, following her being accused of witchcraft, and without saying a word, placed her hands on his chest, causing him great pain and making him unable to speak. Mr. Rowe is no stranger to the courts. Both him and his wife had been in Dover Court back on October 3rd, 1648, being sued for slander, as the wife had been accusing Jane Walford of being a witch. Miss Rowe had been found guilty in that case and was ordered to publicly announce at a public meeting in Dover and Strawberry Bank that she had done Jane wrong, as well as pay her £2. Elizabeth Rowe actually had several cases against her on this court date for slander and other ill speech. This resulted in a public whipping verdict. The 1656 trimmings case was dropped, with Jane being discharged from the court on May 7, 1657. She would return again, now as a widow, on June 28, 1670. When she charged Robert Couch for slander after he called her a witch, Jane won this one as well. I received this information that I just provided for you, interestingly enough, through a family member on Ancestry.com. It's so interesting to get this information from a family member. It was definitely interesting to find it that way instead of just hearsay. Some researchers have mistakenly listed Jane Walford as a Salem witchcraft trials victim. Jane's case took place several decades earlier, but still Jane is featured in many references concerning accusations of witchcraft. Jane was first accused in 1656, and the Salem witch trials took place February 1692 to May 1693. Thomas and Jane Walford immigrated, most likely with Robert Gorges in 1623, and were founders of what is now Charleston, Suffolk, Massachusetts, prior to heading north to New Hampshire wilderness to find a better living condition. Jane Walford was the first accused witch in New Hampshire in 1656, winning every case that she was brought up on. In fact, Jane sued the townsfolk for slander and won, and receiving £5 in damages. Jane and Thomas Walford prospered in Portsmouth, Rockingham, New Hampshire area, and Jane was actually accused of being a witch and for performing witchcraft 3 times. Some say Jane was one of the rarest of the witches to have not only accusations at 3 different times in her life, but to have survived them all. Jane's husband stood by her. She had the protection of her husband, who in the early days of Portsmouth was an important man in town. Since most accusations of witchcraft were made against women, and women had very little status in the 17th century, a woman without a man to stand up for her, like you will hear about next. When I tell you the story of the second woman accused of witchcraft in New Hampshire, we're more likely to end up in trouble or jail. If Jane had lived elsewhere, perhaps in Salem, she might not have escaped a death sentence. One explanation for why she was spared could be the evolving legal system in New Hampshire. Part of the case brought against Jane was spectral evidence, which relied on the theory that a witch's spirit or animal familiar could be sent out in the middle of the night while her physical body was somewhere else, perhaps at home. Jane's neighbor had testified that she was at home. If witches can be in multiple places at once, demonstrating one's innocence might be difficult to prove. Spectral evidence played a major part in escalating the Salem Witch trials, but in New Hampshire, which was home to a mix of Puritans and more moderate Anglicans, the courts were growing stricter about the types of evidence that were allowed. New Hampshire's legal system protected Jane, but accusations of witchcraft continued. In fact, one of Jane's daughters was later accused of witchcraft because of a belief that witchcraft traveled in families, that it was hereditary. To this day, Jane Walford is still associated with witchcraft, even having historical ghost tours of Portsmouth. A trolley tour of Newcastle includes the setting of Jane Walford's story. Over 3 centuries later, the site is still called Witch's Cove. Jane died in September 1681, being tried for witchcraft 3 times and being found innocent 3 times. Eunice Cole lived 12.7 miles away from Jane, or 19 minutes by car. That's how close these two lived to each other. The case against Eunice Cole relied on signs and evidence explained in guidebooks that helped people identify witchcraft, including one published by King James I of England. First, witches were associated with animals, especially cats. This is because after a witch makes a pact with Satan, he gives them a familiar animal or a demon in an animal form. In Eunice's case, signs of familiar animal appeared during her first trial. Her neighbors testified that while they were discussing the possibility that Eunice might be responsible for the death of a child, they all of a sudden heard something scrape against the boards of the windows, but when they looked around, could not see anything. According to documents, the scraping was so loud that it was as if a dog or a cat had done it. Second, a witch can be recognized for her witch's mark. Today, this might be identified as a skin tag or a mole or another sign of aging. I guess I would be in trouble. I think we all have a little freckle or something on us. That's crazy. Anyway, in the 1600s, a witch's mark was the place where an animal fed on the witch's blood. The discovery of a witch's mark was a key piece of evidence in the Eunice Cole trial. During one of her punishments, in which she was publicly whipped, the constable supposedly saw a blue thing like onto a tree hanging downward about 3/4 of an inch long and not very thick. When the court called for a group of women to inspect the mark on Eunice's body more closely, Eunice scratched it off of her body. Eunice was found guilty and sent to prison. Eunice Cole was also known as Goody Cole. Eunice Cole was born in 1590 in England in the United Kingdom and died at home in Hampton, New Hampshire. Eunice was known as the Witch of Hampton, New Hampshire, who could not be stopped. Her husband was William Cole. They came to Massachusetts in 1637, moving to Exeter, New Hampshire before the end of the year. Soon, they moved to Hampton, New Hampshire, 2 years after Captain Mason, who named New Hampshire, died. Both Eunice and William were servants of Matthew Craddock, a wealthy London merchant, a Puritan, and the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Company. After their services with Craddock were over, the Coles were released from service and came to New England, with their passage furnished. Craddock recruited English settlers to move to America to take part in his new venture. If they were granted 2 acres of land in Mount Wollaston, if I said that right, which is now known as Quincy, Massachusetts, on February 20th, 1637. Eunice was 47 years old. They thought they would leave for Exeter, New Hampshire before the end of the year. Very soon after moving to Hampton, New Hampshire, receiving a 40-acre parcel of land, the 5-acre house lot was situated slightly east of where the Baptist Church stands today, on Winnicott Road. The other 35 acres was a good source of income, considering William Cole was a carpenter. The Coles followed John Wheelwright, and somewhat controversial minister. Hampton, New Hampshire is 15.2 miles or 22 minutes from where Jane Walford and her husband lived in Portsmouth, settling there 8 years earlier. By the time Eunice Cole and her husband William arrived in New England in the 1630s, they were already in debt from their passage from England. There are no records of any children. Eunice quickly found herself running afoul with her neighbors. Around the same time they moved into Hampton, New Hampshire, all of a sudden, things started happening for Eunice. She had a mouth on her and was not liked by her neighbors. Virtually, the whole town believed Eunice was a witch. Eunice was charged with slander in 1645. 2 years later, 1647, both her and her husband were charged with stealing pigs. In this dispute, Eunice bit the constable. She literally bit him. She bit the constable. In 1648, Jane Walford was first accused of witchcraft. In the 1650s, things escalated. Instead of neighborhood disagreements, she started being accused of being responsible for her neighbors' misfortunes, such as the death of young children, sinking ships, and ailing cattle. People in church were saying, quote, "The devil is amongst us. If you do not do what the church says, you're going to be struck by the devil," end quote. In 1656, Eunice was taken to Boston to stand trial for witchcraft. She faced charges included bringing sickness on people she feuded with, killing their animals through mysterious ways, and even knowing secrets about people she could only know through aid of the devil. In 1656, Eunice Goody Cole was convicted of being a witch in Boston. She was imprisoned until 1660. The court declared Eunice guilty of familiarity with the devil. This is some debate if she was actually convicted of witchcraft. Some say she was, others say that she wasn't, because her execution wasn't ordered. Instead, she was ordered to be whipped and imprisoned. Officials had Eunice Cole in court 3 times in 24 years, from 1656 to 1680. The court did convict her once. In 1673, Eunice was sentenced to life in prison. William Cole apparently did not miss his wife much. With Eunice in prison, William turned to the townspeople for help with his daily needs, including help on the farm. William could not use his property, though, as means of payment because he had deeded it to Eunice. She had apparently threatened to leave him if he didn't. William petitioned the court to return his land to him, though he did not ask for the return of his wife, who was sentenced to life in prison. Eunice did get herself freed from jail by arguing that her aging husband needed her help. Prior to her being released from jail, William was granted the deed to the couple's property, then promptly died. In 1662, his death created a dispute over the land. The court ordered the town to take the property and to use it to pay for Eunice and William's care. William did have a written will, leaving the property to a neighbor, so the court did give half of the property to the neighbor. Eunice found herself poor and landless, with nowhere to turn. She became the town's responsibility. Each family in town had to take turns providing her with food and fuel, even though they feared her. They would go night and day, actually, without even going and checking on her because they were so afraid of her. Eunice did not stay free for long. The terms of her release from jail required that she leave the colony within 1 month, as her citizenship was taken away. Instead of leaving, Eunice went back to her old ways. Soon enough, she was back in prison. She faced charges of slanderous speech and was in and out of prison over the next 10 years. Eunice was accused of witchcraft again in both 1673 and 1680, 1 year before Jane Walford died in 1681, 1680 being the year Eunice Cole died. So Eunice actually died 1 year before Jane, and Eunice was tried the year of her death. In each case, the court found Eunice guilty of witchcraft, but lacked the evidence for a conviction. In 1671, Eunice was arraigned on charges of witchcraft. In 1673, she was accused of attempting to torture a young girl into living with her, taking various animal shapes and causing a neighbor's oven to produce foul-tasting bread. In 1673, she was found not guilty. Unconvinced that Eunice's crimes met the legal requirements for finding that she was a witch, the court did conclude that there was reasonable suspicion that she had familiarity with the devil. In 1680, Eunice, almost now at the age of 90, the townspeople made one final attempt to have Eunice Cole convicted. They gathered up all the previous charges and added a few more. Once again, she went to court. The court was unpersuaded and Eunice returned home. Other documents say although she was not indicted, she was still kept in prison. Now, another reminder, remember each time Eunice went to to court and jail, she was going back and forth to Massachusetts. So some of these times she just couldn't get back because she was so far away. You got to remember there weren't automobiles during this time. So it's kind of easy to see how these two women may have been confused with the Salem Witch trials. The death of Eunice Cole. Eunice, some say, died in prison in 1680. This was not true. The townspeople tried to have her convicted, but the courts allowed her to go home. In October of 1680, several townspeople remarked that no one had seen Eunice for several days, even though they were supposed to be aiding and helping take care of her. But as they were afraid of her, there were days that would go by that no one went to go and check on her. So they proceeded to go to her home, which was run down, where they did find her dead, laying on a bale of hay in her hut. How sad that they were supposed to be taking care of her. Just because she was a grumpy old woman, they considered her a witch, and she died alone. I kind of find that really sad, to be honest. Upon her death in October of 1680, almost 1 year before Jane Walford in September of 1681, Eunice Cole was hastily buried in an unmarked grave in Hampton. It said that she was rolled into a dugout ditch. Its precise whereabouts are unknown, although it's believed to be near the site of today's Truck Museum. Eunice Cole again died alone in a small hut off Rand's Hill. There are so many rumors of Eunice Cole's death. Rumor was said that Eunice was dragged out of her house that was boarded up because she didn't want any visitors. When she wasn't seen for 3 days, some went into the house and found that she had passed away, so they took her out of the house. People showed up, threw her in a ditch somewhere, and then on top of her grave put a stake with a horseshoe on it to ward off any evil spirits. Some locals have suggested that a stake was driven into her body after her death in order to exorcise the baleful influence she was supposed to have possessed, and a horseshoe was hung on the stake just to be on the safe side. She has been referred to as ill-natured and ugly, artful and aggravating, malicious and revengeful, but some of her locals say certainly not a witch. Others say the townspeople hastily dug a hole as a grave and tossed Eunice's body in it. It's not known exactly when Eunice Cole died. She couldn't be registered because she was not a Christian. All that is known is October of 1680. There's not an exact date. Historical information is sparse, and like the victims of the Salem Witch trials in 1692 and 1693, no one actually knows for sure where Eunice Cole is buried. This right here is an actual court document from April of 1673. I'm gonna advise you, if you want to read the whole document, to please pause this section of the video and you can read it. I'm not gonna lie, with some of the wording and the swooping of the letters, I really can't make it out 100%. Because of the publicity surrounding the efforts to restore Goody Cole's citizenship in 1938, the Goody Cole story was told in practically every newspaper in the country. The National Broadcasting Company dramatized the story on radio coast to coast. Eunice Cole became famous. Her memorial service, August 25, 1938, was broadcast nationwide. She finally got the burial she deserved. Apprehending member, the Society in Hampton Beach for the apprehension of those falsely accusing Eunice Cole of having familiarity with the devil. And what comes next I found so interesting. The research that came with this video was so interesting to me. I found this article that was from Houdini's widow. Widow of Houdini aids in clearing of witch. Hampton, New Hampshire, August 25th. In a unique ceremony attended by Miss Harry Houdini, white-haired widow of the famous magician, the town today cleared Eunice Cole of colonial-era charges that she was a witch. 3,000 townspeople and visitors looked on as 3 selected men burned copies of all records pertaining to her arrest and conviction and imprisonment in 1656. Arnold D. Philbrick of Haven Hill, Massachusetts, descendant of one of Cole's original accusers, had given approval to the vindication ceremony. Final event on the town's treasury program. Goody's citizenship was restored at a town meeting last month. Miss Houdini, in an interview, suggested that Halloween be made an annual vindication day for other convicted witches. I thought this was the coolest thing. I don't know if everybody else agrees with me, but just to see that Houdini's widow was actually involved in this, and that's a name that I think almost everybody knows is Houdini. But Cole, this is actually the first time I've heard of her, and it's great that she was able to get her citizenship back. Cole. The unusual erosion stone erected here in 1963 is in memory of one of the infamous women in Hampton. Eunice Cole was imprisoned more than once for witchcraft. Per court testimonies, animals died or disappeared. An imp was seen as her companion, and she tried to lure on of the young girls to live with her. While she was jailed in Boston, her land and money were taken by the town to provide care for her elderly husband. On her return, she lived her last years in a small hut at the foot of Rand's Hill, where you are now. The townspeople had to provide food and firewood for her or pay a fine. The story goes on that when she died, neighbors buried her in an unmarked grave. This rock right here is now the resting place of Eunice Cole. For years it didn't have a headstone, and it's been said that throughout the years you were actually able to see her roaming around looking for her resting place. And although many people had told this story, there was one story that came from a police officer that saw an elderly woman walking down the road, and he pulled over to tell her to be careful, that it was a dangerous road. And she said, "I'm fine, I've been walking this road for hundreds of years." When he continued to go forward, he realized that, this was an older woman. He turned around and she was gone. After a little while, he realized that it was Eunice Cole. This was the story that he had been hearing from others. He had actually returned to the police department and was so shooken up that he had to go home for the day. But Eunice Cole now has a resting place, and she has been cleared and is no longer considered a witch. These cards here, I definitely recommend reading, taking a look at the pictures. Hit pause on the video and take a read on them. They're very interesting. The research that I had to do for this video, I actually slowed it down because it was so interesting. I did not want to miss anything. What's coming up next, I had read the beginning of it to you. It was on the other paper, so I'm just going to read the additional. In 1938, this is on the bottom portion, in 1938, a publicity stunt for the 300th anniversary of the town, the legend of Goody Cole was resurrected, and it made national news as Miss Harry Houdini was on hand to help with the ceremony of returning her citizenship. In the late 1800s, John Greenleaf Whittier immortalized her in a number of his poems. There have been stories of her ghosts haunting areas for years, and every school child knows some version of the legend. It's kind of like every other legend. I mean, I think everybody knows some version of it, but what's the truth, Like, people still to this day say that these two women were part of the Salem Witch trials, which, by the way, once I am better, that is going to be my next video. I'm not giving up right here. I'm going to go on to the Salem Witch trials. This says Goody Cole Arrowhead coin and GCS membership card of Philip N. Blake, 1938, Harold Fernald Collection, Hampton Historical Society. Originally published in the Hampton Union on October 26, 2018. The coin itself says Hampton Beach, convicted of witchcraft in 1656, restored to citizenship in 1938. Eunice Goody Cole. Old Landing Road. This was the roadway from the ancient landing on Hampton River, taken on October 14, 1638 by Reverend Stephen Batchelor and his small band of followers when they made the first settlement of Hampton, originally named I'm pronouncing that wrong, sorry, Plantation. For the next 160 years, this area was the center of the town's activity. During that period and into the town's 3rd century, Landing Road provided access for fishing, salt marsh haying, mercantile importing and exporting, and transportation needs of a prospering community, which is now the area of where Eunice Cole's memorial stands. That's where the rock is, and that's where her headstone is. So if you're ever in New Hampshire and you're in Hampton, you want to be looking for Old Landing Road if you are looking for the memorial of Eunice Cole. This right here is the road, and on both sides of the road there are actually numerous stones that are in memorial of different people. Eunice is on one side, and there's other stones on the opposite side of the street. So if you go there, Eunice is on the side with the big house. This is the location marker of Old Landing Road. There's other nearby markers. I wanted to put this up here because I don't know if any of my viewers, well, I know some of them are from New Hampshire, but this is the marker, so I wanted to make sure that I included this in the video in case you were interested. And if you do go, please send pictures. I want to see real pictures. Again, this is the landing road marker. This is the roadway for ancient landing on Hampton River, taken on October 4th, 1638. So there's so much history here. It's so great to see. I'm gonna include a little video clip for you. And again, this is the headstone for Eunice Cole. It says circa 1600 to 1680, accused of witchcraft 1656 to 1680. I looked all over the place for information or a headstone or anything on Jane Walford, and I'm sorry I was not able to find anything. So rest in peace to both Eunice and Jane, and so sorry that you were convicted or tried or accused of being a witch in a time where things were unknown and people were unfairly treated for their beliefs. I mean, if you want to believe in witchcraft, by all means, but you know, jail and life in prison, and that's a little crazy. This here is the urn of where all the papers are that had evidence of Eunice being a witch. They burnt them all and they put them here in this urn, again, which is at the museum, where if again, you're in Hampton, New Hampshire, you can go to the museum and you can see this. And last but not least, one more time, in memory of Eunice Cole. And I want to thank you all for being here with us. Again, this will be my last video for maybe a month or two. I am undergoing surgery and I will not be able to make any videos. So I really hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, remember, every day is a mystery.